Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the launch of the Atlantic Council Strategic Papers, which is going to be a series including the release of the Dynamic Stability U.S. Strategy for the World in Transition. Fittingly, the first paper of the series is kind of encompassing the modern world, the paradigm shift, and the developments that are shaping our lives for the times to come. The Atlantic Council Strategy Papers is just one of the more building blocks that has been put by the leadership in developing a new organization for the new times under the leadership of Frederick Kempe, and of course the president and CEO, the chairman, and the rest of the team. And in a lot of ways, it's emblematic of the things that are happening under his leadership, namely addressing the real issues in a bold, smart way, without fear, looking for a real analysis, and last but not least, looking for the solutions. Because at the end of the day, that's what counts. When the Atlantic Council was discussing and looking for new ways to enhance its presence and frankly to fill the vacuum that has been left in the last 10 years in a strategic thinking in this great town of ours, Washington, the Atlantic Council is trying to step in and develop a series that is going to provide different angles from the smartest, braves, and the people with a sense of humor that would be able to see the new realities in new ways. And the final idea is to compile and extract and condense these findings in a volume that after November 2016 is going to be presented to a new administration for something to be considered. Before I continue, I would like to introduce the two authors, actually 3 of them. The one of them is just the supporting staff, but it was so nice of Barry and Peter to involve him and include his name on the cover. I think it's a decent thing to do. And Barry Pavel is the Council Vice President and Director of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. He also served at the White House as the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Defense Policy and Strategy at the National Security Council under President George W. Bush and President Obama. Peter Engelke is a Senior Fellow in the Scowcroft Center Strategic Foresight Initiative, where he works at the intersection of geopolitics, demography, economics, virtually everything. So it's quite interesting what he's doing. In addition, he has been previously a fellow at the Stimson Center, where he was linked to environmental change with the global security challenges. The paper that they have developed is the number 1 and of the Atlantic Council strategy papers, and is definitely timely and relevant. And as much controversy it developed, probably it would be a criteria that it hit a nerve, or not. We'll see. There is no doubt that the world today is in a process of transformation. We kind of start to agree on that. That this is not exactly the world that we would like to have. And most importantly, the different pieces are not fitting in overall picture and understanding that has been developed in the course of the last 50 years. So basically, the paper is trying to address all these issues, and most importantly, not just to analyze them from my perspective, unique point of view that could be quite useful for the further analysis, but to provide the United States point of view. How the United States, allies and partners, would be able to determine a strategy that would adequately address the issues, and most importantly, provide for a strategy that would work. And it remains to be a big question. that's why this paper is so important, as we hope is going to give the tone for the further papers. And that's about it. Fred asked a very important question: what would be the main critique of the papers? And I was thinking about that because he asked pertinent questions. I think the main issue would be whether we have the political will to do all that. But we'll see how we're going to help with these papers to develop a strategy in that perspective. We're lucky to have with us today a panel of experts, whom Frederick Kempe, Atlantic Council President and CEO, will introduce just in a few minutes. They will offer their insight on this strategic paper and open the floor to audience questions. So we have certain informed discussion, critique, relevant ideas, etc. We'll look for the next papers of the series, and it's now my great privilege and pleasure to turn the floor to the President and CEO of Atlantic Council, Fred Kempe, as well as our paper authors and panelists, Dr. Thomas Wright, Dr. Nora Bensahel, and Ambassador James Dobbins.
Well, I saw she was about to crush under the weight of it. It's wonderful to see you all here, and we're also being recorded, so as you ask your questions, please make clear to us who you are and who you want to address them to. Good afternoon. I'm Fred Kempe, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. This moment brings me particular pleasure, and let me tell you three steps to where we got. One of them is we made a decision a few years ago to relaunch the International Security Program as the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. And in the conversations I had with General Scowcroft about this, he talked a lot about strategy. And he said, it's great doing policy, but how can you do policy without strategy? And he really wanted the Scowcroft Center to be a strong part of what the Atlantic Council is, a policy shop, but that we had to become a strategy shop, that we had to be a place where strategy had to lead policy. He talked a lot about the Cold War, where strategy was easy, or relatively easy. It took us some time to get there, starting in 1948 and really unfolding through 61, 62. But we landed on a containment strategy for the Soviet Union and communism. But the tactics were hard. And then what tactics would you have? And I think General Scowcroft would argue that in this current period, we've been mostly tactics and not enough strategy. And so our effort right now in this opening paper is, and through a number of other activities taking place in the Hurry Center on the Middle East, but also in the Scowcroft Center more largely globally, is to take a look at various elements of strategy. What is strategy? How do we execute strategy? And how do we actually start a national conversation between now and the 2016 elections that gets us more or less on a common page about what America's role in the world is and how we ought to think about and how we ought to go forward. It's a pretty grandiose vision, but I think it's worth the effort and it's worth starting this. So those are the steps in getting here. While doing that, I had a conversation with our executive committee member of the board, Alexander Murchev, and we talked about papers, and Barry was very much involved in this, that would go a little bit deeper than some think tank papers do. A little bit longer, a little bit more meat, a little bit more footnoting in order to really kind of develop some of these ideas. And I think that this initial paper, in my own view, is just a wonderful start. And I want to thank Alexander for his vision in getting these sorts of papers going. And Barry may want to talk about a couple of papers yet to come. I want to thank the board members and members of the diplomatic community who are here with us. A few of our panelists are also part of a strategy consortium which has been meeting regularly since last year. It's a collaboration among institutions in Washington and beyond. If you want to do this kind of work, you don't do it in a selfish or self-centered kind of way. You really have to be collaborative with the best strategic minds you can find. And we're hoping to help build a group, sort of an ecosystem of strategic thinkers with others around town, among think tanks, universities, private sector policymakers in the United States and abroad, and then serve as a convening forum for its members for discussions and debates on a quarterly basis. This paper alone has brought together so much interesting background debate as we were forming this, and I think it's gone through 10 or 12 edits. So whatever you don't like about it probably got edited out. I don't know. In addition to the paper's authors, we're honored to have with us today a panel of eminent scholars and scholar practitioner in the areas of international relations, foreign and security policy. And they're going to discuss the paper and the issues it raises. As Alexander said, first Peter and Barry are going to talk a little bit about the paper. And then after that, our speakers, and in the order that I'm naming them, will be Nora Bensahel, Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the American University School of International Service. And she's had senior positions at the Center for New American Security and at RAND. She taught at the Security Studies program at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown for more than a decade. Ambassador James Dobbins, Jim is one of, I think, one of really the outstanding diplomats of our times. Senior Fellow, Distinguished Chair of Diplomacy and Security at RAND, held State Department White House posts including Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, Special Assistant to the President, Special Advisor to the President, Secretary of State for the Balkans, Special Advisor to the President and Secretary of State for the Balkans, and Ambassador to the European Community. And it was called that then, Jim? Okay, just wanted to make sure. And he also served as President Obama's Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan as well, most recently. And then one of the real top thinkers in this whole area of work, Thomas Wright, Dr. Thomas Wright. And Tom is a fellow and director of the Project on International Order and Strategy, a really fascinating project in this whole set of issues at the Brookings Institution, and has previously served as the executive director of studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And in Chicago, he also lectured at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, and as a senior researcher for the Princeton Project on National Security. So these people will have a lot of experience and knowledge from which they can take whatever pot shots they want to have at this paper and introduce any new thoughts that they think we should put into this. But let me turn first to Barry and Peter. Let me just say, we went into this knowing that there was a national security strategy. The 2015 National Security Strategy was actually a good, and we believe quite an excellent characterization of the novel aspects of the current global security environments. However, many of us here felt that although the NSS was great at description, it wasn't quite as good at prescription. And this paper is really aimed at trying to take what we thought was an excellent paper in characterizing the situation and taking a step further, incorporating global trends, including disruptive technologies, into a strategy to help America get to a better position, not just for its own global leadership, but global security and prosperity. In some ways, when I first read this paper, I thought maybe it's overly ambitious because it was trying to include so much in a small package, but I think it actually pulled it off, outlining global trends, key technologies, current and future geopolitical situations, and a pretty detailed strategy. But what I liked about the dynamic stability element of this is this whole notion that we can't change that the world is going to be, for lack of a better term, messed up. And pretty unstable and volatile in the years ahead. But the United States has certain characteristics of its own nature that makes us pretty well suited to adjust to these times. But I won't steal any more of their thunder. Let me turn over to Barry and Peter to give you a little bit of a feeling what's in the paper.
Well, thanks very much, Fred. I want to get to the debate quickly, but I'll just offer my half of the brief outline and then turn to Dr. Engelke. But a quick thanks to the community that really helped on this, and I won't be able to mention everyone's name, but General Scowcroft himself, we had a very detailed discussion about the concepts in the paper. Dr. Murchev also, whom you've heard from, Steve Hadley, Fred himself really engaged and dug in, and also Matt Burrows, who is the director of the Strategic Foresight Initiative here. And if you look at the last major document he did when he was at the National Intelligence Council, Global Trends 2030, it really set the table for the work we did. We just took it a little bit further, but Matt should get enormous credit for that brilliant work and for the related work he's been doing. And then, of course, to my co-author, Peter, and to Alex Ward, who was extremely helpful in the entire endeavor. I'd like to start this conversation by remembering when I was the head of the strategy office, or actually the deputy in the 90s, we had an Army officer who was a tank driver. And I have to say, if you see the movie Fury, you'll understand they have a different approach to life and a different philosophy. And we were writing all these strategic documents at the time, the defense strategy, contributing to the national security strategy, and we were putting, post-Cold War era at the time into it. And he stopped me at one point and he said, this isn't the post-Cold War era, it's the interwar period. And that, I think, I remember that now because we're in a period where a lot of people are struggling to name it. In this document, we give it a name. It might not be the right name, but I think a really important part of strategy is to offer a sense for what's going on. I mean, how do we filter? How do we sort of digest and process all of the developments, and how do we make sense of the patterns if we can? So just very briefly on that, there's a lot of stuff going on, but there's two major trends that we call out in the paper. One, a very significant shift of state power to Asia, and to a somewhat lesser degree to the global south. But this is a very dramatic shift, and I think this audience knows the details of that shift as well. But there's a second major set of trends that is more novel and more uncomfortable, and we spend most of the time in the paper on our suggestions for dealing with this set of trends, and that's what Matt called in the Global Trends document, individual empowerment. The power of non-state actors to take strategically significant action on a local, national, or regional, or even global scale is increasing very, very significantly, driven by, number one, the rise of the global middle class for the first time in human history. It's projected that by 2030, 5/8 of the world's population will be in the middle class and not the lower class. They're going to be demanding things, they're going to be consuming things, and they're going to be a force in general for good, but also for demands, for example, regarding governance that their governments won't be able to meet. They're heterogeneous, but they will be active and restive, and I think we're seeing the leading edge of that in the general restiveness of populations in almost every region of the globe. Second, though, and we spend quite a bit of time on this, disruptive technologies, a huge wave of technologies. We're living in sort of wave one of communications and information revolution, but coming soon and already playing out to some degree are revolutions in manufacturing through additive manufacturing, 3D and 4D printing, biotech, which the Silicon Valley experts tell me may be the biggest revolution, able to do a lot of great things dealing with chronic diseases, but also a lot of very dark things, including the possibility for bioterror or bioerror, because there's a lot of people playing with and experimenting with, and hacking is the new term, is the term being applied, hacking biological organisms. And then a number of other technologies we can talk about. But so these are the two key trends undergirding this massive shift of power to non-state actors. And the main premise of our paper is they have to be recognized when you're thinking of global strategy. I don't think it's any longer sufficient to say it's an international system, it's a global system, because it's not just nations that are dealing with each other, it's nations that are dealing with individuals, groups, corporations, et cetera, that are not traditional actors. And it's our main premise in the paper that this has vast implications for strategy that we're missing in many ways that the paper goes into. It also has implications for the higher level priorities of U.S. strategy. And to summarize sort of our elevator pitch in this regard, the U.S. has pursued stability in key regions since the end of World War II. We erected a lot of institutions. We've, in many ways, erected the post-World War II international order, and that order benefited us, and we think many, many other participants in the system. And in our paper, we say stability is still very important to pursue in certain key domains, the order on the high seas, and a number of other domains. We still want to pursue stability, but it's no longer sufficient. And what has to take its place alongside stability is the pursuit of harnessing dynamic change for our national advantage. There's a lot of change going on, and if you don't put it at the highest level in national strategy, you're going to miss it, you're going to miss the opportunities, and you're going to miss the dangers, and they're going to compound unless we, as a government and as an alliance and a set of international allies and partners, look to track those changes that are going on, look to then identify how we can best leverage those changes for our advantage, and then reorganize ourselves and our alliance systems to better do that. And we have a lot of work to do. And the changes I'm talking about are vast, but they include not just the technology revolutions, but the energy revolution, the urbanization revolution, which Peter is an expert on, and a number of other just vast changes that I think we're missing as an apparatus because we're not focusing on them. So sort of short bumper sticker, pursue stability, but also harness the dynamism, and that's why we look to, that's why we labeled the concept dynamic stability. This will require a much more activist U.S. approach than we've seen for quite a while. I hope we're up to it. I'm very confident that we're up to it, but it takes, as Dr. Mercheb said, quite a bit of political will, and it will take a new approach to not just developing strategy, but executing it and implementing it in our national systems. I'll end by just saying our hope is that this starts a debate, but the time is getting late to be sort of looking to a different concept or set of concepts that will help us to achieve our goals in the world. If we don't start to do something in this area, I fear that the headlines we're all seeing on a weekly basis, literally by the week, that things seem to be getting worse, are going to continue. And now I'll turn to Peter for the second part of this outline.
Great, thank you, Barry. So the other sort of two major sections of the paper, and I'll go through them very quickly because I likewise want to get to the broader discussion with the audience and with our panelists as well. One is the first section, really the third section in the paper is on the question of what America's ends ought to be. We felt it was important to have a section on this topic because we need a conversation about whether or not America's ends going forward are similar to those that we've had in the past. Our answer is yes, they ought to be. And therein lies the problem in some ways, right? The world that we constructed, or I should say the world that we helped to construct after the Second World War, was a world that we believed is and continue to believe, I think most of us, as those of us who are Americans and are certainly our allies and partners around the world, is a world that is based on a certain set of premises about norms, values that we think are universal and that we think are frankly just, and that they've proven to be so in more instances rather than fewer over time. So our argument is that we have to basically develop strategies, which we interpret as basically the means, to apply to a set of ends. And again, we can agree or disagree on whether or not those ends ought to be more similar or less similar than they have in the past. The way in which we parse this equation is to funnel the dynamic stability equation through the four familiar buckets that we're used to talking about when it comes to ends, which are basically values, the question of values, a question of prosperity, the question of security, and the question of protection of the global commons, which is a familiar sort of quadrilateral, if you will, of topics, or if you will, buckets. So some of this will be familiar in terms of the packaging. We add a few wrinkles that we think are interesting and novel. For example, on the question of values, yes, we agree very much that the values that Americans have stood for, and that we stood for both in sort of the creation of the world that we have led since 1945, are worth preserving going forward, and are also that American presidents and American leaders of all stripes have articulated through the course really of American history. So that's the familiar set of things, right? Sort of democratic governance, rule of law, respect for human rights, minority rights, all of these kinds of norms that we believe in. And we add a few wrinkles, one of which would be, for instance, this idea of whether or not that messaging can be pushed too far or not. In other words, whether or not the American insistence on the universality of its norms is something that might not always benefit the United States, depending on how the message is both sent as well as received abroad. And so there's some discussion of this question in the ends section. And so similar treatments about how we are aspiring to sort of a similar set of ends going forward, but perhaps we need to think about parsing those a little bit differently given the world that we now inhabit, and given the strategy that Barry and I have developed that we call dynamic stability. The fourth and final section of the paper is really a bit of a micro dissertation on the sort of the major state actors, frankly, that are in the world that may or may not have the material capabilities, the aspirations, as well as other features that may or may not give them the ability to sort of join the United States or supplant the United States in terms of leadership of the global system going forward. And so we go through the list of characters. They're all familiar to all of us: Russia, China, India, Europe as a whole, and the so-called middleweight powers, which include both the wealthy middleweight powers and the so-called emerging middleweight powers. And then at the very end of that section, treat basically the United States as its own. So, and the upshot of that is that we do try and parse this equation as one where we're fair to all of these different players in the international system in terms of their relative capabilities, as well as their what we perceive to be the weaknesses of each state, the United States included. And we basically emerge from this saying that there's still a strong case to be made, despite questions of shifting material capabilities in the world, and that's most relevant when it comes to China, perhaps secondarily to India, that the United States is still uniquely positioned to actually lead going forward, and that has to do with, of course, a broader variety of things than just the material equation. There's also certain aspirational element to our ability to lead that stems from both our history after the Second World War as well as who we are as a people. But also that the United States, amongst all the players, and I think this is perhaps a core part of our argument, is in some ways uniquely positioned to take advantage of all the trends that Barry talked about at the very beginning of the paper, the trends that are leading us into what we call the Westphalian plus world. In other words, the nature of American society, the nature of American culture, the nature of America's economy, our history, all combine to basically position us as uniquely well-suited to take advantage of the shifting ground of the international system in a variety of ways, and therefore we do still stand at this moment having the ability to lead. The final section is a very short conclusion, which asks the question, and frankly does not answer it, that Alexander said at the beginning, which is that may be true, but perhaps the biggest question is, will Americans continue to seize those capabilities and do what is necessary, both in terms of our own domestic political equation, our society, our economy, as well as the way in which we parse changes in the world, to actually lead going forward, the willingness to lead. And with that, I'm done.
Thanks. Thank you very much for that really concise and strong overview of what you will all see in front of you and be able to read. I'm going to go down the line. Each of the panels will have 5 minutes to take a look at the paper and give their responses. Let me just say a couple of things at the outset that any of the three of you may want to deal with or not, but they're sort of on my mind. And one of them is, if you look at strategists throughout the ages, I'm not sure they've factored in non-state actors to the extent that one is arguing for here. I may be wrong. But you would have had no communism had it not been for the Industrial Revolution and the non-state actors of the labor movement, and labor in general. So for me, that's sort of interesting. It was there. There were non-state actors before, and they played a role. But is this a unique way of looking at things? And then how do you actually work that into national strategy? And then the other thing that I think is a big question in the paper is the U.S. leadership going forward and what we want the U.S. to shape. To what extent is this wishful thinking? We've gone from 50% of global GDP in 1945 to 18%, perhaps declining now. Certainly that's going to take a different sort of leadership to get done what we want in the world. And so it's part of it has to do with political will, but part of it has to do with resources. And then how do you lead? And so one of the questions I really have throughout this whole process, and really for the U.S. in general, is how does one lead not only in a different age, but also with a different relative weight. So let me just leave those out as a couple of initial questions, the role of non-state actors and the role of the U.S. in general, and then pass first to you, Nora.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. One of the things that I found most interesting about this concept that you guys put forward about dynamic stability is that it puts a really fine point on the dilemmas that I think the United States faces today. And to put it in the broadest possible terms, that's a dilemma of the dilemma of a status quo power, basically, at its core. And how does a status quo power adapt? The historical record shows that this is actually a very difficult thing to do. As you said, the United States benefits tremendously from the international order. We created it, so it's not surprising that we do. But as you point out, both today and in the paper, lots of other actors do as well. So it's not entirely a self-serving strategy. And the fact that the ends that you guys put forward in your paper are remarkably similar to every strategy document since World War II is not surprising either. I mean, you emphasize the role of non-state actors more, and I think that that's appropriate given the dynamics that you talk about increasingly empowered individuals with access to technology. But this is a time of rapid change and complexity, and I would argue that we are at, in many ways, a strategic inflection point in the international environment that doesn't come around too often, where a lot of the principles are up for grabs, and it's hard to see exactly how the power structure is going to settle out. We had one of those after World War II, certainly have one with the end of the Cold War. For the United States, certainly after the September 11th attacks. And now we're in a post-war period coming out of the long wars and expensive wars in both blood and treasure in Iraq and Afghanistan, and trying to make sense of the dynamics and how we move forward in that world. The threats that the United States faces today, with probably just a couple of exceptions of nuclear proliferation and so on, are not fundamentally existential threats. But there's still a lot of talk that the world is a more dangerous place today than it's ever been before. You hear a lot of that, and I think what that reflects is that the number of threats is increasing. The types of threats, as you point out in the paper, are changing. And because of these underlying dynamics in the world that you so rightly point to, the complexity has changed. So we're trying to manage a greater number of challenges with a greater number and new types of actors at a time when complexity is increasing. And so you get second and third order effects of what you're doing in one area that affect others. And I think it's that complexity that is leading people to say, this may be the most dangerous time ever. Even if you look at what the individual threats are, they certainly may not compare to the nuclear existential crisis of the Cold War. That's where I think the real value of this paper comes in, to be able to acknowledge that complexity and to put forward some ideas on how the United States might accommodate that, to adjust the international order in ways that benefit us and our partners, and as you said, and I share, that benefit a broader community in the world, but also to preserve the key elements of that order that have proven so beneficial. In the paper, you outline 4 general guidelines for strategy, and I wanted to highlight 2. You can read all of the other 2 in the paper, but since we only have a few minutes, to highlight 2 that concern me in particular about the future direction that the United States is heading in. The first is that you talk about the need to adjust interstate mechanics, and that's how you get the state-on-state piece of your strategy in here. And I do think that's very important, and Fred, this picks up on your point. I mean, U.S. power in relative terms certainly is declining, has been declining. It would be shocking if that were otherwise, given where the United States started after World War II, with everybody else's, being decimated after the war. But that does pose lots of challenges, and I think that your paper rightly points out that means we absolutely need partners and allies, because this is not something that the United States should but really can undertake on its own, even if we sought to. I would say that the part of the paper that frustrated me the most is I wanted more details on that. I wanted more on the how. Because and as I said, historically this has proven remarkably difficult. I think that's the challenge that we're all facing today. I wanted more details, I wanted more examples, I wanted more ideas of how to do that. And then I realized that on your cover it says strategy paper number 1.
Watch this space.
Yeah, so I'd really like to see strategy papers.
We're going to give you so many ideas.
Exactly. So I encourage you to have strategy papers number 2 through 37 or whatever it is. Take your basic concept and talk about how to do that, because I think that's really the key challenge going forward. The second principle that you talked about that I have...
Just to address that, to a certain extent, that is the idea.
Right.
And the second paper, for example, I think is going to be about saving cyberspace. And so then how do you do that?
Right.
How do you take this and then, Right.
The second principle that concerns me about the future of the United States, you talk about the art of strategy, and you've cleverly stolen someone else's acronym for that. With the A being agility and the R being resiliency, both of which I think are incredibly important in this dynamic, shifting international environment. I would say, though, that I'm increasingly concerned that the US government, at least, is neither of those things. The government is slow and ponderous and bureaucratic. There are reasons for that. The US government, this is, American Politics 101. The US system was designed to be slow, ponderous, and bureaucratic, having to do with the separation of powers. And now, for a variety of reasons that have very little to do with national security, we seem to be kind of paralyzed in this partisan conflict on the Hill with Congress that isn't doing very much, and lots of political warfare, but very little actual governance getting done. You mentioned as an example of the innovation that we need to do the Defense Innovation Initiative. That's important, but I found the snarky side of myself coming out when I read that and said, if that's the extent of our agility and innovation, we are in very deep trouble indeed. And that leads into my final point, which gets to this question about the ability of the United States to lead versus the willingness. And I think you characterize that exactly right, and I think that ending the paper on that note is very strong. But I would actually take it even further than you did in the paper, because you talk about the importance of getting the domestic audience engaged and having Americans on board to support policies. I think that is absolutely right, but I don't think it's sufficient, because I'm just as concerned, if not more concerned, about what foreign audiences take away from this, what they're reading about our willingness to lead. It's very clear, I think, for our adversaries are looking at our system, seeing our weaknesses, seeing our slowness of decision-making as a constraint, as a weakness of ours that can be exploited. But I would say it's actually, in some ways, they're concluding that we don't have either willpower or staying power, which I think is a very problematic dynamic for the United States in the future. But I actually think it's even worse on what it's doing to our allies. Because I think a lot of allies are starting to question our commitments and our credibility and our staying power and our lasting power. And because we need them so much for the reasons that the paper demonstrates, I think that's an underappreciated dynamic that, it's really easy to see the effects of, disputes in Congress at home, but I worry a lot about what signal it sends to, to our adversaries, but particularly to our friends abroad as well. I'll stop there and turn it over to Jim.
Thank you very much, Nora. That was terrific. Jim, you have your own set of comments that you are already in your mind and about to come out. But let me add one more complexity. I admit, I've come from the news industry, and I can't help but read newspapers every week and see how it fits into these sorts of arguments into the real world. And you're not only a strategist, theoretician, but you're also a practitioner and have been a big practitioner. As I watch this week for an exciting strategic moment, and also talking to people in investment around the world, it looks more like the global Silk Road idea of China. I mean, that looks like grand strategy to me. Maybe it's not. And this is happening with President Xi Jinping in Pakistan, a place you know extremely well. At the same time that Secretary Kerry is going to come here and tomorrow at the Atlantic Council and argue in favor of the geostrategic and the national security arguments for these trade deals, TPP, TTIP, and the Trade Promotion Authority. Now that has the makings of something pretty grand, but it's a long way for us from his address tomorrow to actually passing these things and then setting up a new sort of trading system. So that's a very long way of saying are we being outmaneuvered when it comes to strategy at the moment?
Well, on that point, I mean, I think that the TTP, actually, it looks like we're going to get congressional fast track. That's a pretty substantial hurdle.
Yeah.
And I do think that that's a geopolitical instrument in pursuit of a strategy that's at least as important as the Chinese Silk Road and comparable in terms of its impact. And with a much larger and more important set of actors. I mean, China is talking about Central Asia and Pakistan. That doesn't exactly compare with the entire Pacific Basin, which is the objective of ours. So I think we're okay there. Now, let me just say, I share virtually and support virtually every single proposal in the paper without necessarily fully buying into the underlying premise of the paper. I think the premise of the paper, which is not solely in this paper, but elsewhere in the general zeitgeist, is that the pace of change in the world is accelerating, that U.S. power is declining, that there's a breakdown in the global order, that nation states are eroding in favor of non-state actors, and that we face an unparalleled multiplicity of threats. And I think all of those are somewhat exaggerated. I think there is a very brisk pace of change, but I don't think it's any faster than it's been for about 150 years. Computers and computer technology certainly make a big difference, but they don't make as big a difference as electricity did, as telephones, radio, and the internal combustion engine did. I can remember living 50 years ago. 50 years ago, you only had 12 channels of TV, not 250. But you could jet to Europe in 8 or 9 hours. You could jet to the Pacific in half a day. You drove the same kind of cars. The person's day-to-day existence was virtually identical today, except he didn't have the internet. Okay, that's a difference, but it's not as big a difference as if you go back another 50 years when nobody had a telephone, virtually nobody had a radio, virtually nobody had a car, and where it took a full week to get to Europe and a month to get to Asia. So the pace of change was actually greater than that. And then if you go back another 50 years and there was no electricity, no internal combustion engines, no telephones, so yes, the world's changing and we've got to harness that change and stay on top of it. But this is not new. Similarly, in terms of global power, the U.S. global power has eroded vis-a-vis China. Yes, and that's it. It hasn't eroded vis-a-vis Europe. It hasn't eroded vis-a-vis Russia. It hasn't eroded vis-a-vis any other country in Asia. It's gone from 50% of global GDP to 25% in 1970. And since 1970, it's gone, and I have a slightly different figure than yours, from 25% to 22%. Now, you may have been using purchasing power parity, which gives you a slightly different answer. But from 25% to 22%, and it's now going up. In other words, because we're growing faster than almost every other developed country, our proportion of GDP is going up this year, not down. So the shift from 1970 to today is minuscule compared to the shift from 1950 to 1970. So again, this is not an accelerating trend. It's a trend, and it really only applies to China, period, not to anything else. So don't generalize from China would be my argument, although clearly China is a major and growing challenge and needs to be dealt with in that terms. In terms of the breakdown of global order, the answer is Middle East is breaking down. Again, don't generalize. Nation states are doing just fine in Europe. They're doing just fine in the Northern Hemisphere. They're doing just fine in South America. And they're certainly doing fine in East Asia. So the Middle East is in a state of chaos. Okay, that's not new. It's new for the Middle East. Hasn't happened for 70 years. But it happened in Southeast Asia. It happened in the Balkans. Remember when we had 6 or 7 civil wars going on in Central and South America all at the same time? So there have been other regions that have been just as chaotic, that produce conflicts as large, indeed larger, than the ones that we're currently seeing in the Middle East. Now it's the Middle East, and that's a serious challenge. It's a new challenge. I'm not suggesting it's the same as the Balkans or the same as Southeast Asia, but it's the same in sort of the dimensions of the challenge that we face. And finally, you know, the idea that the world is becoming more dangerous, that General Dempsey could say that this is the most, I can't remember the exact quote, but the most dangerous time we've ever faced. You know, I've got to say, get a grip. You know, I'm old enough to remember literally hiding under my desk at school while air raid sirens went out and we practiced what to do if a nuclear bomb went off in New York City. Okay, I can remember doing that. I can vaguely remember the several Berlin crises, the Cuban Missile Crises, the war in Vietnam, the war in Korea, and incidentally, I remember the Tet Offensive coinciding with the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. Okay, so get a grip. You know, this is not the most dangerous time in our lives. The incidence of conflict in the world, both civil wars and international wars, has been going down for 70 years, and particularly going down since the end of the Cold War. And most academic writing and theories believe that the level of violence and conflict will continue to go down. That's the best guess of most academics. You wouldn't guess it from today's headlines, and it's certainly not going to go down in the Middle East anytime soon. But nevertheless, the progress is still for declining levels of both civil and interstate conflict. So I think I'm not suggesting the world isn't changing, it is. I'm not suggesting that every one of the trends that has been talked about don't need to be addressed and that we need to adjust for them. I'm just suggesting that we've done it before and we can do it again. And we shouldn't suggest that this is an unparalleled challenge.
Thanks very much for that. That was a very useful intervention. And let me say a couple of things, and I know Barry and Peter will come back and adjust all of this. Just first of all, global trade economy is not a zero-sum game, so if China does well and we do well, you can put that together and it'll be all right. But the Silk Road concept is global. It's not just regional for China, and that's the interesting thing about this new idea and the way they're promulgating it. On the level of violence and conflict, I think what people are looking at right now is you have a Russia with nuclear weapons where we had achieved a certain way of speaking with each other, and we had red lines and we had rules and and a lot of those practices are gone. So how do we get ourselves back to a world where we have some order and where we're discussing all that? We can bring that back. So you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis was pretty damn scary, no doubt about it. But the question is, you know, as people talk about the more dangerous world, do we have a set of norms and practices that we achieved over a long period of time with the Soviet Union, or are we actually in a more dangerous situation than we realize because we don't have that? Do you want to just hit that part quickly before I go to Tom? This question of more dangerous or less dangerous world.
Yeah, I mean, the world is more dangerous than it was 5 years ago, but it's not more dangerous than it was 30 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 100 years ago. So all of the trends that the study indicates are underway. All of them need to be coped with. All of them require some change and innovation on our part. I'm not challenging any of that. I'm just suggesting, as I said, that this is not that unfamiliar in scope, and that we're perfectly capable of it, and that you know, for instance, the non-state actors as an important dimension. You know, at the end of World War II, non-state actors managed to challenge every colonial empire in the world and create 100 new countries. Those were non-state actors acting through insurgency and terrorism that created that world. Okay, so this is not, you know, we've dealt with comparable challenges before. They're not identical, and you're right. We need to grope towards some new understanding of how to deal with Russia, a Russia that's different than the one we anticipated and the one we hoped for.
Thank you for those provocative comments, Tom.
Great, and thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me here. It was a great pleasure to read the paper. It was slightly more of a pleasure when I read it earlier today, and after Jim's comments, I was actually going to make a very similar point on the complexity. That was one of my sort of the bugbears I have with the paper. But now I need to come up with something else. So I may just reinforce what you said. I would just start to say a couple of things I really liked. I didn't agree with some of the paper, but I do think that it was one of the best sort of cases advocating one of the key positions in the discourse. So I think there is a argument out there that does say the world is more complex than ever before. There is rapid change. It is mainly about non-state actors. It talks about this sort of dynamism, and I think this was the best sort of articulation of that I've read. I have a slightly different sort of view on some of it, which I'll come to in a minute. But I think the other interesting thing I liked about it was that for the strategy debate over the last 10 years or so, I think there's been an overemphasis on decline and also what I would describe as sort of a predeterminism about who's going to win the century. So people look at it and say, it's going to be China's century, no one's going to win. And to me, that's a lot like, at the beginning of a sports season, baseball or soccer, you say, so-and-so's the favorites to win the World Series this year. And, over 50% of the time, the favorites don't win, but you say it because it makes sense at the beginning because of the data you have available. But what actually matters is how they play the game, as opposed to, the assets that they have at the start. And I think that we're coming out of, in the strategy debate, we're coming out of the preseason phase of 21st century strategy discussions where the game's actually just begun, and now we can stop all trying to pick the winner and just and concentrate on how to play it. And not to belabor the analogy, but if you went back before World War I and said who would win the 20th century, some people may say the US because of growth projections, but there's no way you could predict, because more important than any data point, more important than any sort of characteristic of any state was the strategic choices and decisions made in Berlin, in Moscow, in London, in Washington. And the United States made better choices, fewer mistakes than other countries. And because of that and a whole bunch of different contingencies and developments, we call it an American century. But it's impossible, to deduce from just GDP numbers or whatever. So I liked the fact that you didn't sort of dwell on that, determinism of, will America's sort of core strengths mean the US will prevail, and really looked at, what should the United States be doing. I did like, Jim, the old versus new complex did sort of jump out at me a little bit, because as I won't repeat what he said, but just a couple of additions, to it. There is new stuff happening, but it is not necessarily completely new. The transnational actors, for instance, communism was probably the most transnational force we've seen in the modern, state era. Certainly much stronger, I think, than sort of Islamic fundamentalism. ISIS recruits via Twitter, in Iraq and Syria, but there were plenty of people going to join the Spanish Civil War or other conflicts. They didn't need the internet to get there. So I think that there is a, that there is a continuity. I think the question, the reason why I think this is a bit of an issue is that when we frame it as new versus old, we sort of assume that we're bad at the new and good at the old. Right, so it's like we're not good with all these new developments, but we actually have the interstate stuff pretty much sorted out. We have revisionism, all of those old challenges pretty much sorted out. And my personal view, which may be wrong, is that basically the toughest problems are the older problems that are coming back, right? So incremental Russian revisionism or Chinese revisionism in the South China Sea taps into a very old strategic logic that causes huge headaches for any power that has to deal with it, right? Traditionally, just this is one of the toughest problems in world, history and world politics, and we're beginning to encounter it again. And just the same way that the British didn't really know how to handle it, we don't really know how to handle it either. We're sort of feeling our way and trying out different things. So I think that that's a bigger challenge, just to me, than some of, mastering some of the technological stuff. Although obviously the old problems take on a new hue with the technology, because they use tools they didn't have available before. But to me, what counts really is the fact that there's a competitor, there's somebody actively trying to sort of damage the US-led system or to prevail over, the US president or America's allies or whatever. And that makes it a little bit different than there just being technology or new developments available. The second and sort of final point I just wanted to make was I thought, one of the thing I liked about the title of the paper is sort of this, stability, dynamic stability. And it reminded me of a quote by Bismarck, that basically world leaders can't really remake the world out of whole cloth. They have to sort of look at the big trend of history, or what he called sort of, God's hand, and then jump on the hem of the garment and try to ride that a little bit. And I think you were getting at sort of what those technological trends are. To me, though, that there are sort of there is dynamism in the international order, and I think it's fairly. I mean, this is pretty conventional wisdom, but to me, there are sort of three big things, and they're all regional. It's the rise of sectarianism that's tearing the Middle East apart. It's Russian revanchism in Europe, and it's China's ambition, revisionism, and the balancing that invokes in its neighbors. And those are the three big forces that the United States has to either figure out which side it's on or figure out how to deal with if it's sort of clear, if it's clear cut. And to this sort of, does that make the world more dangerous or not? It depends how you measure it. I guess it doesn't if you're looking at it in death numbers, in fatalities. But it may do if you're saying, is the international order less stable now than it has been for quite a while? And I think it is. I mean, I think that the U.S. global power is often negated at the regional level because regional powers or regional actors have many advantages. They have the advantage of proximity. They have the advantage of being able to take the initiative. It matters a lot more to them than it does to the United States or to Europe. And so I think that there are sort of big forces there. And I think they will use technology. They will use this other stuff. But I think that if we figure that out, that will be like 90% of the game. I know Ebola is very serious, all these other things are very serious, but sometimes I don't think they rise to that level. I think they are problems that we can figure out because everyone's basically on the same side. But to me, the greatest ingredient of complexity is when you have another major power that's trying to defeat you. And so for me, the last 25 years were probably more simple than any other quarter-century period in a couple of centuries. And when everyone says
because that power did not exist.
Because that power, yes, the United States could invade Iraq, and there wasn't a risk that Russia would intervene on the side of Saddam and give him nukes or arm him. And now that's changed. It's beginning to change. I think the world was pretty simple. It was hard. It's always hard, but it was more simple than before. It's becoming more complex because of this new great power rivalry that's coming back. And so that's sort of the way I would look at it. But that's, I think, these are legitimate sort of differences. So what I liked about the paper really was, I think it was a really strong sort of case to say, no, this is more, complex. There is a wide variety of things. You can't just focus on the major powers. And there has to be a much more sort of holistic idea of order and a problem solving. So. And
in short, less stable construct, but not necessarily a more dangerous one.
No, the way I would, so when people sort of look at why, is the world becoming more dangerous, they assume you're moving from 1990 to 1914 in a blink of an eye.
Yeah.
Right, like that you're going from something that's pretty good to something that's horrific. I think it's more likely we're in, 1890, when, Bismarck dies, Wilhelm comes in and it's into his own, and it's the beginning of a long process of erosion that will at some point be very vulnerable. So, the vulnerability potentially started last year or the year before, this year, whenever, and then over time that will continue unabated and lead to more crises. So it's a long burn, it's a slow burn sort of thing, rather than we're jumping straight forward to, to a calamity right now. So I'd say the risk has gone up. But yes, I mean, on a day-to-day basis, people living their lives, I don't think they're much more likely to be killed by a nuclear weapon today than they were last year.
So I love it. So we're either at 1890 or spring training. So we want to get the audience, but do the two of you want to do a quick response to any of the points you've heard and underline quick?
I'll be really quick, but these are fantastic comments, and this is exactly the debate we need to have, I mean, as a community. I'll just hit like two big issues. I don't think we said this was the most dangerous period.
No.
And I agree with Jim. I don't think we clearly, objectively said things are moving faster. I think we said they appear to be, so perceptions are important. We did say things are extremely unpredictable, and this is because of the multiplicity of actors. Is this new? Is this non-state actor phenomenon new? I think the new aspect, surely in the past, non-state actors going back to Adam in the Garden of Eden, had a role. I haven't gone back that far before.
The serpent was a non-state actor.
But a non-human actor. Yeah.
Clearly they're not new, but I think the global scale, and surely recruits went to the Spanish Civil War, but we now have unprecedented global connectivity, awareness, perception that we have never had before in human history. And this gives people who we don't know the power to organize in a way that they've never had in human history, much more quickly, much more covering a larger landmass. And so I think the difference is in scale. And my projection based on foresight, which is not always accurate, but the projection that the paper suggests is you ain't seen nothing yet here. Because the biotech revolution, the manufacturing revolution, after that, quantum computing, robotics, algorithms, this is all coming out in a way that we have no idea how these are going to combine, but I think it's going to be a bumpy ride that is unpredictable. And so I'm not as clear as Tom that the toughest problems are the old one. We probably would have said that on September 10th, 2001 as well, but we didn't know what was coming. And my suggestion is we don't know what's coming, and the reason in the paper that we spent more time on the non-state actor piece is because the U.S. government apparatus that I was a part of, and Jim's been a part of, and others, is extremely uncomfortable in dealing with that part of it. Not in terms of tracking terrorists, which we're good at, but we do not know how to leverage non-state actors and deal with unpredictable non-state actors who are coming together in ways that we cannot predict. The last thing I'll say is, Tom said there's three big problems now: Russia, China, and the sectarianism in the Middle East. Well, 2 years ago, we probably would have said there's two big problems now, the rise of China and extremism in the Middle East. So my point is, we could be sitting here next week and there could be 4 big problems. And in 2 months, there could be 5 big problems. Or it could go back to 2. We just don't know. And so I'm a little less comfortable with the clarity on the dynamics in 3 particular regions today that we don't seem to be very good at projecting.
So Barry, as per usual, says everything that I could say far better than I could say it in a shorter time frame. I'm sorry?
Absolutely the right thing to say about your boss. I just want to
No, I mean, look, I think thank you so much for all of those comments, and obviously they're thought-provoking, and agreed that, the question of whether or not, on the non-state actor question, for example, of course non-state actors existed before, our own period, and of course they were agents in the world. The question is whether or not that there's been enough of a change to sort of introduce the non-state dynamic into the equation about how we think about strategy in maybe a more forceful way than it's been done in the past. And our answer to that question is clearly yes, that's what we should be doing for all the reasons that Barry talked about, and more too, about the sheer number of human beings, for example, who live on the Earth now compared to 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, would be one thing, and how well educated they are, their material aspirations, how that's changing the ecology of the Earth, for instance, and whether or not we're entering into, you want to talk about inflection points, whether or not the Earth itself is in an inflection point. My answer is yes. It's called the Anthropocene. Those kinds of things are, something new under the sun, so to speak. So I think that that's what we're trying to say, is that there's really a scale issue on the non-state side, as well as a speed issue, and there may actually be a difference in kind issue. And Barry highlighted we ain't seen nothing yet in terms of the technologies. which clearly are important, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think that I want to get to the audience. First of all, I'm sorry it took so long to get to you, but I think the richness of this discussion, you can forgive us because I think we really got into things. I like this, what I would call the spears to bombs to bio issue is, as you say, it's not a more dangerous world. Well, the era of bombs, was it more dangerous than the era of spears? Well, I don't know, but then what are we going into in terms of technology? Let's come back to the three of you on that for your final comments, but let's pick up some questions. Frank, if you could wait for a very quickly moving microphone.
Thanks. I thought both the paper and the comments were terrific. The comment I have is that I think the United States takes very good advantage of non-state actors. We did it with respect to the development of the internet. We did it with respect to energy. To go along with Jim's point, so did Henry Ford. He was a non-state actor. So I think we ought to think that we have an overall capacity to really use non-state actors in a very positive way, and the whole United States market, if you want to call it that, as well as the markets that we interact with around the world, are really developing very well. And I would have less despair. The other point I'd make is that we have actually changed some institutions. They have the same names, but they're somewhat different. NATO is a good example. And if you look at where Europe was, say, in 1990, pretty shaky, Balkan Wars had started, and where it is for the most part now, Russia aside, NATO enlargement, EU enlargement, pretty good things. So I think there are reasons to have a positive approach to some of these things. I don't dispute any of the points made. It's just that I don't think it's all negative, and that we have some capacity really to go forward in a good way.
Thank you. Comments, please. Oh, we're going.
Hi, Robert Shred of International Investor. Great presentations and analysis too, but I wanted to ask if there's one omission I see, and maybe you can correct that in the future. It's the same one that the intelligence community may have made in the 80s, and that is no economist on this group, and more economic analysis maybe could be used. The reason I bring that up is because I think Mr. Wright made a very good point. Prior to World War I, anybody could have emerged victorious, but it was the fastest growing economy in the world that made the difference of who was the leader of that century. The only emerging competitor to the United States in terms of economic growth is China. So my question is, I see that you did have a chapter on China. You point out that they're going to grow fast, but there are many obstacles. So my question really is, why is there no discussion about our continuing policies, trade, economic, and otherwise, that continue to allow China to grow as fast as it might, and to the ability that it's now going to be outgrowing us?
Deal with the economic elements, also not just the authors, if any of the other three of you want to deal with that as well. You may want to foreshadow a little bit of papers that are coming too.
I mean, in terms of, I'm not a trade policy expert, although I was an applied mathematics economics major in college, so maybe that comes close to your criterion for the panel. The post-World War II U.S. strategy, when you think about it at its core, was relative decline. We wanted to build a system where we could increase and expand the zone of prosperity and security. And over time, we had the Asian tigers, and now China, first Europe, which we helped rebuild. And so I think this is something that is a deliberate byproduct of U.S. strategy. Bob Manning here at the Atlantic Council has written articulately about this in a previous strategy document. I think we want to build up markets, and we want to build other powers to rise economically. As Fred said, it's not a zero-sum pie. It can lift all boats if we do it right, and if the rules are the same, and if the norms are the same. And I think that's a key question is in the headlines as we speak this week. But again, I'm not a trade expert. I think on Frank's points, I mean, again, I think it's a question of degree. Yes, we've leveraged non-state actors in the Cold War. We're okay at it. I know when I was a government policymaker, gosh, we mainly thought, especially in the Pentagon, we mainly thought about state actors, and I don't think we're very good at leveraging, in particular, non-traditional non-state actors. So in other words, General Jones has been very articulate recently in talking about how the way the United States should engage with other countries in 2015 is not with an official government delegation only, but sort of a delegation that's public-private. We have a cyber paper coming out that talks about not developing government cyber strategies, but having a private sector-driven strategy, because they own 80 to 90% of the subject matter expertise. They know how the infrastructure works. Government should work much more closely with the private sector and let them drive certain policies. Obviously, new types of modalities would have to be arranged, et cetera. And then in terms of institutions, gosh, that might be where I disagree. I just don't see our current apparatus in terms of its the way it works, the culture, the procedures, the lack of ability to really leverage our network to deal with a world that's increasingly networked. I just don't see it yet rising to that task, I think, as Nora was suggesting. I think we have a long way to go to revolutionize, or to at least give our government, even if we keep the same departments, some of the processes and network capability to be able to deal with the world 24/7. I mean, I think you're seeing it a little bit with the current administration, where the inbox seems to keep rising because they just things are just very slowly attended to. We have a Russia policy review still going on right now, more than a year after the Ukraine crisis really heated up. So that's just one example, but I think we have a lot more to do in terms of institutional machinery.
Anyone, do you want to deal with it now? I mean, the one thing that you touched on before, Tom, why don't you weigh in here?
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say the one thing Jim touched on before is U.S. growth picking up, and U.S. growth has been double that of Europe for a long period of time, and if that continues, and Japan. And the demographics is good, the innovation base is good, so I think a lot of our position in the world is going to rely on that, Tom.
Yeah, I just
and we were lucky in the sense that the Soviet system was economically so inefficient and ineffective, so I buy everything you're saying, please.
Just make a real quick point, both on the economy point and on the public-private sort of non-state actors. On the economic, I think one thing that is changing is that if we do see more great power competition, those countries aren't going to want to get into conflict with each other because the risks are so high. And they will turn instead to economic mechanisms like sanctions. And I think that penny's begun to drop, obviously, in Europe over Russia and Western Europe. Russia's delinking, Europe's delinking from Russia. But I think we're likely to see that at a more global level as countries hedge against the risk of conflict. We've integrated for 25 years without any consideration to geopolitical risk. If it's made economic sense, it's happened. I think that's probably changing. Just on the public-private thing, I think one of America's great assets is the United States is stronger than its government. So it's not just the private sector can be influential without a public-private partnership. And there's a huge way that private sector engages with the world in many different ways, many different areas. I think it will be out of the control largely of the government, but I think it will overwhelmingly be to its benefit. And so I think just the nature of the American system, I think, is a real asset, even if it doesn't go through sort of official channels.
Answer, please. Pick up these.
Hi, my name is Haim Nawaz. I want to ask a question for Ambassador Dobbins. Sir, you said the region is going through a challenge that is not unparalleled, that happened before, and you're correct. During World War II, Nazi Germany, and you have the Holocaust. In the Middle East right now, you have a rising Iran that probably can be nuclear, and they want to destroy Israel. So it is parallel. I'm just curious if you still think that with that challenge, the embassy should get a grip on the area or not. So And then the question is also for Mr. Berry. The 4 primary ends that you have in the report, I think you're saying that we should pursue 4 primary ends in the decades to come. On the executive summary, values, prosperity. We're already doing this. I mean, what's new? Thanks.
Jim, do you want to pick that up?
Well, I think we are dealing with the Iranian threat, first directly by trying to negotiate an agreement which will preclude their developing nuclear weapons in the short to medium term, and otherwise engaging in security cooperation with neighboring states. So I certainly think Iran is, one of the pivotal countries in the Middle East. The Middle East is in turmoil, and Iran is part of that. It's not the only cause. In fact, it's probably not the principal cause of turmoil in the Middle East, but it is a cause that we need to deal with.
Let me pick up the last 2 questions here, and then we'll do a final round. Yeah. Oh, I guess it's the last 3 questions. So we'll
Behind me?
We'll pick up 3. Sorry?
Steve Grunman, I'm the Lund Fellow here at the Council, and I would appreciate the panel addressing the question of American leadership. I think an ulterior, if not an express purpose of these papers is to inform a conversation about America's role in the world. And I guess the pointed form of the question is whether we may or may not be at an inflection point in terms of global trends, but are we at an inflection point, or are we not at an inflection point about the expression and exercise of American power? I'd be interested in your thoughts about that, particularly if I may. There seems to be a nostalgia, I suppose, in the critique of the Obama administration's exercise of American power for some model of American power, of America's role in the world that in my opinion is no longer as relevant. And indeed, one of these papers I hope in the future we write is what's a 21st century model of how America effectively and to its strategic ends can exercise power that's not simply a nostalgia for Reagan or Roosevelt or Kennedy.
Please. Did you have I'm sorry, did I see one more there? No? Okay, just these 2 then. All right.
Thank you. My name is Jean Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I should stand up. I follow up with the question about leadership, and I'd like to focus on the political will and the points that Nora made, that we need agility and resiliency. And so the question is to Ambassador Dobbins. You gave us a broad scope that things are not changing. Has there been significant change in the way that the leadership of the U.S., especially the White House, Congress, our agility, our resiliency, our ability to come to a consensus, cohesive political will? And that has everything to do with our coming elections in 2016 and what has happened now. It also has to do with the sequestration and the debt ceilings, and we deal with it every time. Is there anything that you think you would suggest or recommend to solve it, especially now that we're converging the global market from our free market to a state-owned enterprises, different kind of market? And so that our financial, you say that our GDP, we have significant trade deficit, so our financial capability has lessened. So that gives us a lot of problems with external financial exploitation to our political system, the super PAC. Is there any concern with that?
Thank you for that. I think these 2 questions are related really to the nature of how the U.S. Itself is changing these.
Sustain our leadership.
And this really also gets to the one of the points of the National Intelligence Council's Global Trends 2030 when they were, the game changers. It was very alarming for some that the U.S. was listed as one of the game changers, meaning uncertainties, U.S. leadership going forward. So why don't I go with the panelists, and we'll go in reverse order of how you started. And any other final comments you want to make, we're down the last couple of minutes, but particularly on this question of You talked about the U.S. made better choices and fewer mistakes. It's hard to predict what choices and mistakes we might make in the future. But on the other hand, the nature of U.S. leadership in this period of time, I think, is what these last two questions touched on.
I would just very briefly just say that I think if you look around the world, the U.S. has many challenges, but in most of them, particularly in Europe and Asia, it's within a framework that everyone sort of accepts and understands, right? So people sort of understand the Russia, challenge to be in its immediate neighborhood and toward the European security order, which the U.S. sort of values and sees as important. And it's a similar situation in East Asia. And I think those things will continue, and that there will be, ups and downs about the level of U.S. commitment, but basically it will be solid, and it will go up if necessary as the problems develop. The one that I think is very different is the outlier, is the Middle East, where I think I get a sense anyway, talking to Middle East experts, that they really have no idea what the framework is anymore, or what the U.S. objectives should be, or if the U.S. should have a role in providing regional order. And when you lack that sort of analytical framework, I think the risk of major mistakes goes up, right? Because there's not as much of a North Star to sort of guide you. So that's what would worry me, probably. But my guess would be that in the absence of any good sort of guidance, the U.S. will probably do less and try to limit its exposure to the crises and the problems there, rather than to engage.
Jim.
Well, we've been on kind of a roller coaster in terms of American style of leadership over the last decade or so. I mean, I sometimes caricature the Bush administration style as policy without reflection, and the Obama's administration style of reflection without policy. And that's obviously, oversimplification. But I would say that we're in, that one of the reasons that people feel uncertain about our ability and willingness to lead is that we're in a situation similar to the post-Vietnam situation, where there was a feeling about retrenchment, a feeling that we were overexposed, a feeling that we weren't ever going to do that again. And the Carter administration, particularly in its early years, was criticized for the same kind of lack of decisiveness and effectiveness that you've seen with the Obama administration. I think that's a phase that's likely to pass. The disappointments over Iraq and Afghanistan will eventually get over it, and maybe do the same stupid things again. But in any case, it's almost certain that the two candidates in next year's election will both campaign to the right of Obama on foreign policy. That they'll both be more hawkish than the current administration. That's almost certain. And so you'll see some corrective in that regard. I also think that there's a serious, particularly if you get inexperienced presidents, there's a learning curve, and there are very dangerous periods over the first several years during which administration gets its grounding, particularly if it's a change both in party and in personality, and you get somebody with relatively limited experience. You go through some very difficult times. I do think that the polarization in the country more generally, as evidenced in the Congress, but also evidenced in a number of polls and other academic writing, is dangerous and does make American leadership more difficult.
Thank you, Jim. Nora.
I would just end with two quick points. First, we spent a lot of time talking about non-state actors and are they new or are they old? And obviously they've always had an effect. They've always been there. I think what is changing and what I think is important to be thinking about for the future is that the types are changing. That doesn't mean, terrorists and insurgents have always been around. They will clearly continue to be around, particularly as our adversaries see weakness in our responses to them. But I think one of the things that the paper does highlight really well is we haven't really seen before a world where a non-state actor comes down to an individual, a particularly empowered single human being. And I think that's a change in kind, even if the concept of non-state actors being influential certainly remains a constant.
A super empowered non-state person.
Yeah, and I was actually reflecting on this when reading your paper. This goes back, this is actually not a new concept of 2015 or 2014. I remember reading The Lexus and the Olive Tree, right? That's Tom Friedman's formulation, super empowered individuals. Yeah. So, this idea has been around for a while, but the trends are continuing to, grow and change, and I think that's certainly something that is going to have, you didn't used to have to worry about the security threat coming from one human being. Now we're going to have to figure out how to accommodate that. Second, final comment on American leadership. One of the things that concerns me in the debate, I tend to look at the things that are concerning. I do agree that a lot is going well. The U.S. has a lot of advantages, but I think we always want to be working on the places where we're not as strong to try to improve them. It is a very uncertain time, and especially coming out of the two wars, I think that's exactly right. People are uncertain and not necessarily sure about the future of American power in general. I worry about the opposite effect too, that there are people who are calling for the more robust exercise of American power and defining that in military terms. Anybody who is in this community knows that U.S. power is not just military in nature. Anybody smart, I think, acknowledges that it's not even primarily military in nature, though the military has a very important component of that to play. I was struck by this, reading the sentence in your paper, which I think is exactly right, that American power ultimately derives from its ability to lead by ideal and inspiration instead of by force, and I would add, or coercion. You didn't use that phrase, but, the lesser version of force. And I think that has always been our strength. I think trying to think about the exercise of U.S. power in military terms is very easy for people to understand and reach for and conceptualize when the world seems kind of scary and there are dynamics going on that we don't understand, that if we just used our military to reimpose order, everything would be okay. And you hear that in the political debate. Sounds like a straw man, but it's not. And I think we need to guard against that. I think that the way you formulate that in this paper is a useful reminder about some of the political discussion going on today about what the true sources of American strength are and how we can exercise leadership most effectively.
Thank you very much, Nora. We're a couple of minutes over time, but I'd like to give Peter and Barry a chance to make whatever closing remarks you have based on what you've heard, if you have something burning that you want to get out.
So on the political willingness question, we do leave this one, Steve, a bit open-ended at the end, and that's deliberate. The paper is 57 pages long. We can't cover absolutely every single question, so please cut us a little bit of a break that we don't try to go into everything. But part of the answer too, of course, is it's an exceptionally difficult question to answer, and I don't think anyone has the exact answer. But I think one of the problems, and I think one of the reasons why we wanted to write this paper, I'm speaking for Barry a little bit on this one, and because we haven't actually talked about this yet, but is that whether or not the world is actually becoming more complex, whether or not it's actually speeding up, it certainly appears to an awful lot of people that that is the case, right? And that the world is far more, if you will, diffuse. It's whether that's a media phenomenon, whether that's simply information overload from all the different sources that we have, and I think one of the byproducts of that is that it's also less clear what we should do about that. So and strategically, right? How do we think about that as a country? How do we think about that in terms of political leadership? And how do we think about that in terms of America's role in the world? And the answer is not self-evident, I would submit. It isn't. But we need to at least have that conversation. And I think I perceive this paper as being necessary in my mind to begin to articulate analytically where we're headed, where we think we're headed at least, and what we might do about that going forward, and to begin then creating the bases in which we can begin answering that question of, well, how do we galvanize, if you will, national consensus around a particular set of strategic actions.
Thank you, Peter. Right.
Just the one closing thought I'll have, just to be clear, and the paper's clear, but my presentation might not have been as clear, that we ultimately are extremely optimistic about the United States and our allies and partners to effectively navigate this new world despite its complexity and rapidity and global connectivity and all the other oddities that we talk about here. But I think it requires a new approach to how we think about our foremost national goals, and in answer to the one of the closing questions also, a new approach to how we go about achieving them in a world that is different enough, in our view, different enough from the pure Westphalian system that was enshrined in 1648. It's a different enough world with different enough actors that we need to change how we go about achieving those long-standing goals that we talk about in the paper. So just end by saying we're very optimistic. The U.S. And its partners and allies are best placed to do this effectively, but we really need to change our approach, and we need to ensure that we lead at a time that really cries out for leadership in dealing with the challenges that are coming up in almost every corner. So it's time to have this conversation, and it's time for the United States to sort of step up with its allies and friends in a different way.
I'm going to paraphrase Jim Dobbins in closing this session, where I hope at the end of this process of strategy papers, or we may well continue it over time if we find it useful, that we're going to have reflection and policy. And that whomever may be elected will be compelled to have both through the actions and the papers and the thinking that we might leave behind. I want to salute Alexander for his vision and leadership on this project, Barry and Peter for this terrific paper, and the work you're doing forward on strategy in the Scowcroft Center, and then Nora, Jim, and Tom, thanks so much. These are really useful comments. Afraid we can't go back and re-edit this one, but I think we're going to take a lot of, well, maybe we can, but in any case, we're going to take a lot of your ideas on board, and thank you very much for them.
Thank you.